Sometimes I suspect that Jehovah Witnesses just like to be contrary to the facts. Today's topic is no exception. We're talking about which way was Jesus crucified. Now, in case you don't know this, Jehovah Witnesses believe that Jesus was crucified on a post, with his hands above his head. One nail went through his arms, and we believe that Jesus was crucified on a cross. So where did Jehovah Witnesses get this idea and this teaching from? Well, in their own teachings, they say that Jesus was crucified on a torture stake. That's what they call it. It is not the word. I mean, honestly, the word staros in Greek does mean post. I'll give them that. But let's keep reading. Here's what they say. They say, and the torture stake that Jesus was crucified on was an instrument such as that on which Jesus Christ met his death by impalement. And in classical Greek, the word staros, rendered torture stake in the New World Translation, mind you, it's not translated that anywhere else, but in the New World Translation, Jehovah Witnesses Bible, it is translated that way. Rendered torture stake in the New World Translation primarily denotes an upright stake or a pole. Now watch this. I love these next words. This is where I feel like they're just trying to be contrary to the facts, okay? So it says, and there is no evidence. We're going to hold them to that. There is no evidence that the writers of the Christian Greek scriptures used it to designate a stake with a crossbeam. Well, I'd like to beg to differ. Number one, the Bible and the New Testament was written within the Greco-Judeo context, so Greco-Roman Judeo context. So vocabulary that the Christian church used came from the Jewish scriptures, and it also came from the Greco-Roman context. So when we're reading Greek, which was the language of the Greco-Roman Empire, they were using words that had a common meaning. And so what the Romans meant by these words was probably what the Christians meant as well. And that's going to be important as we're looking at what the word staros or cross actually means. So I would like to take a look at some of this no evidence and let you decide which it is. Was Jesus crucified on a post or was he crucified on a cross? So when we look at this, the first evidence that I want you to look at is Josephus. Now, what Josephus talks about, well, first, let me actually say this. Josephus was writing in the same century that Jesus was walking on the face of the earth. Now, Josephus was born 3 years before Jesus was crucified, but he was still aware of and wrote about the practices of the Romans. So the fact that he's in the first century, just like Jesus Christ was in the first century, matters. And notice what he has to say. So he says, the soldiers out of wrath. Now, what's the context here? The context is that Josephus is talking about the wars that the Jews had with the Romans, and that the Romans were trying to capture Jews who were attacking them, and they were crucifying them. And notice the way that they were crucified. It says, so the soldiers, out of wrath and hatred they bore to the Jews, nailed those they caught, one after one way, and another after another to the crosses. By the way, notice they said they were crucified and nailed in different ways. So there isn't just one way that the Romans were bound by. They didn't just always crucify people with their hands above their head. It just said they crucified them this way, that way. So the evidence so far suggests that there's more than one way to crucify a person. If we go to Lucian has this very interesting thing. By the way, the Roman people felt kind of superstitious about the word or the letter tau. So tau in Greek is the letter T, and they didn't like the letter T. Notice for what reason they didn't like the letter T. It says, men weep and bewail their lot and curse Cadmus over and over for putting tau, which is the Greek T, into the alphabet. For they say that their tyrants, speaking of the Romans, following his figure and imitating his build, have fashioned timbers in the same shape. Get that? They're fashioning timbers, pieces of wood in the same shape as the letter T. They fashion timbers in the same shape and crucify men upon them. Oh, imagine that. People being crucified on a T. Now, remember, Jehovah Witnesses just said there's no evidence that such a thing ever happened, and that the Christians who wrote their Bible during the Roman period, there's no evidence that they would have ever meant a cross when they said the word stauros. Well, look at this. It says, and that it is from him that the sorry device gets its name, the stauros, the cross. And notice Lucian is writing in the 2nd century. So he's still writing during the same Roman Empire. And he's saying that people are being crucified on T-shaped pieces of wood. Let's find some more of this no evidence, shall we? Lucian talks about Prometheus. Now, Prometheus is a fictitious mythical god, and he's writing about Prometheus being crucified. And notice how he says Prometheus is about to be crucified. And this is telling he's using real world ideas of crucifixion, and he's bringing it into the mythical world of the god. So he's saying here, he says, Hephaestus, which is one of the gods, says, let him, Prometheus, hang over this precipice with his arms stretched across from crag to crag. Arms stretched across. Very interesting. That's how they're going to crucify him. And it says this, and Hermes, the other god, says the very thing, steep rocks, slightly overhanging, inaccessible on every side, no foothold but a mere ledge with scarcely room for the tips of one's toes. Altogether a sweet spot for crucifixion. Now, Prometheus, come and be nailed up. There is no time to lose. Apparently, I don't know, Prometheus was eager to be crucified, but notice his arms being spread out was how he was going to be crucified. Again, this is very interesting, no evidence about how people were crucified, but let's keep looking at some more no evidence. So we have also Seneca. Seneca writes about this. He says, again, this is really telling. Notice that he's 4 BC to, what was it? Let me look at that again, 65 AD. So Seneca the Younger is writing about crucifixion in the same time frame that Jesus was alive. And he says, I see crosses there, not just of one kind, but many made in different ways. Oh, well, it's possible that some people were crucified on posts. It certainly actually happened. But so he's saying the Romans weren't just limited to one way of crucifying people. There's more than one way to skin a cat, as it were. So he says, I see crosses there, not just of one kind, but made in many different ways. Some have their victims with their head down to the ground. Some impale their private parts. Sorry for that, just being the messenger and reading the evidence. Others stretch out their arms on the gibbet. Stretch out their arms. Maybe like that. Maybe like T-shaped crosses. Unless the Romans were nailing their hands into the air, but I don't think that they were. Let's keep looking at a little bit more of this no evidence, okay? So Justin Martyr, early church fathers say this, that the lamb, the Passover lamb, notice again, Justin Martyr is writing in 100 AD to 165 AD in the same Roman Empire. Here's what he says about the crucifixion. He says that the lamb, which was commanded to be wholly roasted, was a symbol of the suffering of the cross. And notice how he says that the lamb was roasted. He says, the lamb was a symbol of the suffering of the cross, which Christ would undergo. For the lamb which is roasted and dressed up in the form of a cross. And notice the form of the cross. Pay attention to the no evidence here. It says, for one spit is transfixed right through from the lower parts up to the head. That means one like this. And then he says, and then it says this, and one across the back. So I'm assuming it means like that. That's part of our no evidence here that Jehovah Witnesses say that there is. So, all right, looking at a little bit more no evidence, Tertullian says any piece of wood planted upright in the ground is part of the cross. The upright part is just part of the cross. That's what Tertullian is saying. All right, so Tertullian, writing during the same Roman Empire, A piece of wood planted upright in the ground is part of the cross, and indeed the larger part of the cross. But we Christians are credited with an entire cross, complete with a transverse beam and a projecting seat. That's the shape he's talking about. All right, a little bit more of this no evidence here. Tertullian writes again, he says, just like Seneca says that the Greek letter tau and our very own letter T, speaking of the Latin word, because Tertullian was a Latin writing father. So he says that the Greek letter tau and our own letter T is in the very form of the cross. So much for no evidence. But wait, there's more. Get this. Not only do we have the writings, but we have ancient depictions, and I'm only going to give you two of them. There's more than two, but there are ancient drawings and depictions of how people were crucified with their arms spread out, okay? So looking here at the Hercules freeing Prometheus. By the way, this is a statue that was created between 30 BC and 130 AD, the same time as Jesus Christ was walking on the earth, mind you. So the same time period, there was this statue of Prometheus being crucified, and notice the position of Prometheus's arms out to the side. And this is Hercules freeing Prometheus from being crucified at that rocky crag. There's also Alexamenus graffito, which is this thing right here, the Alexamenus graffito. So let me give you a little context here. So apparently somebody knew a guy by the name of Alexamenus. And Alexamenus was obviously a Christian. And the person who wrote this graffiti was making fun of Alexamenus. And notice, though, how he mocks the Christian faith. He mocks the Christian faith as people who believe in a God who was crucified in a T-shaped cross. And the writing in the Greek reads Alexamenus Sebetai Theon, which basically means Alexamenus worshiping God or worshiping his God. And that is obviously a Roman critic, skeptic of the Christian faith, mocking it for what they believed. And what they believed in was Jesus was crucified on a T-shaped cross. Now, lest I digress away from unless we get away from the Bible. So let's just ask ourselves a question. Does the Bible itself have any internal evidence that tells us how Jesus was crucified on the cross? Shall we look? I think there is some evidence internally to the scripture. And first thing we find is in John 20, we read this. So in John 20, Doubting Thomas, poor guy is always going to be known as Doubting Thomas. Doubting Thomas says this, unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, not the mark of the nail in his hands, the mark of the nails, plural. So unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, which he uses the Greek word halon, which is a possessive form of the Greek word halos, which means nail. So he says, unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails in the place, and I place my finger into the mark of the nails that were in his hand, nails plural. It says, unless I put my fingers into the mark of the nails and place my hand into his side, I will never believe. Thomas needed evidence and he needed proof. And what was he looking for? Evidence of the nails, plural, that were in Jesus's hands. Now, let me ask you, if Jesus was crucified with his hands above his head, would Thomas's comment make sense? Would they have used two nails through Jesus's hands above his head like this? Or do you think that sentence makes the most sense with Jesus being crucified like this? Now let's look at this. Notice how Jesus says that Peter is going to die. And here's what it says. John 21, 18 through 19. Jesus says to Peter, he says, truly, truly, I say to you, When you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted, but when you are old, you will stretch out your hands. Stretch out your hands. Why? Keep reading. So you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. And what did Jesus mean by you will stretch out your hand? He meant, verse 19, this he, Jesus, said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God. So when Watchtower is trying to tell you that there's no evidence that Jesus was crucified on a T-shaped cross, you can say, probably not in the most academic words, but you can say, liar, liar, pants on fire. So here's my conclusion to the matter. My conclusion is this, that Jesus Christ, based on all the evidence, based on the fact that the Roman Greco environment, that Roman Empire, same Roman Empire, which gave us the word cross and defined what the cross meant, because it was their instrument after all, was probably the same cross that the New Testament was talking about when Jesus was crucified. In other words, Jesus was crucified on a T-shaped cross. That concludes today's podcast. My name is Pastor Greg Thornberg. I am from Redemption Bible Church in Casa Grande, and you are listening to our podcast.